Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 2 Samuel. Hey guys, welcome to the Bible Explained podcast. I hope you had a great 4th of July celebration for those of you who live in America. For the rest of you, I'm sorry that I took a day off, but it was a very relaxing day. I went to a parade in the morning with my husband. I knew some people in the parade, and yes, they did throw the candy at me. They saw me, they threw the candy at me, and I did get some candy. I was fighting those children for that candy. Oh, it was a good time. And then we went to a party later on. One of the elders at my church threw a party with a really cool fireworks display. So we went there during the evening. So it was just a nice, relaxing, overcast day. But the overcast was actually kind of nice because it was cool the entire day. Like, it was still humid, but it wasn't so sweaty and so hot with the sun like beating down on you. It was a very, very nice and enjoyable day for me. And I hope you guys had an enjoyable day as well. So tell me what you did yesterday. I would love to hear it. Okay, let's read 2 Samuel 14. The second half of it, we'll be reading verses 22 through 33. We'll be talking about a few things that David did wrong with his parenting and with his family in general. And also, I need to apologize for Wednesday's episode because I got something wrong, and I'm going to talk about that today as well. All right, let's go ahead and read this. I'll be reading out the WEB. Joab fell to the ground on his face, showed respect, and blessed the king. Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord king, in that the king has performed the request of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Jeshurun and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. The king said, "Let him return to his own house, but let him not see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house and didn't see the king's face. Now in all of Israel, there was no one to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. When he cut the hair of his head, now it was at every year's end that he cut it, because it was heavy on him, therefore he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight. 3 sons were born to Absalom and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman with a beautiful face. Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem and didn't see the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. Then he sent again a second time, but he would not come. Therefore he said to his servants, "Behold, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom to his house and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Absalom answered Joab, "Because I sent to you saying, 'Come here, that I may send you to the king,' to say, 'Why have I come from Jeshurun? It would be better for me to still be there.' Now therefore let me see the king's face, and if there is any iniquity in me, let him kill me." So Joab came to the king and told him. And when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. David has a ton of redeeming qualities. He was a great leader and a great king. He was a good warrior. He believed in God and worshiped Yahweh as his God. He was very humble. He was considerate of other people and very kind. He had so many redeeming qualities. But he was a terrible family man. He was so bad at doing the family thing. He had too many wives, many of which were illegal according to the Old Testament scriptures. And also he was a terrible disciplinarian. He didn't know how to discipline his kids. And we can see that over the past 2 chapters that we've been studying here in the book of 2 Samuel. So in the last chapter, David's firstborn son, Amnon, who was on the way to becoming the next king, basically, he was first in line for the throne, Amnon raped his half-sister, who happened to be Absalom's full sister. Now, Absalom was so angry at Amnon that he devised this scheme to kill Amnon after 2 whole years. So David had all of this drama and all of these issues happening in his family because David didn't handle problems when they arose. So here's the first thing David should have done. even before having kids. The first thing he should have done was he shouldn't have been marrying people who were outside of Israel. And his one wife, Maacah, happened to be a Jeshurite. She was not of Israel. Now, Maacah was Absalom and Tamar's mother. And the reason David shouldn't have married somebody outside of Israel was because the Old Testament said not to do that, especially for kings, because other nations worship other gods and they have other cultures. And so if a king is marrying somebody that's from a different culture who has different gods, that's going to be a problem because she's going to bring that stuff into the family and potentially influence the king and influence her own children to worship after other gods and to do other cultural things that were not permitted in the Old Testament laws. So David shouldn't have been marrying for political advantage, which is what he did. That's the first thing David did wrong. But he did marry Maacah, and he had children with her. So what David should have done at that point was he should have been an active father. If you look at David, he was pretty absent from his children. He wasn't really around. And he didn't teach them the Old Testament scriptures. Here's what Deuteronomy 11:19 says. Teach these laws to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. This means that parents are supposed to have an active role in teaching the scriptures to their own kids. This means that parents themselves need to have a good foundational knowledge of scripture, firstly, in order to be able to teach their kids the scriptures. And secondly, this also means that they need to be teaching their kids. They need to be leading through example. And David, unfortunately, didn't do that. He didn't teach his kids these Old Testament laws. He was very absent. He was not a good father figure for all of these kids he had, probably firstly because he married so many wives that he had so many kids. How can you be an active parent when you have that many kids all living with different mothers, you know? So that's another problem that David had. He wasn't teaching his kids. And thirdly, he was just a bad disciplinarian. So when a problem arose, David didn't address it immediately. Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, when a crime is not punished quickly, people feel it is safe to do wrong. The ESV of this version says, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. So if a parent is just letting their kids get away with stuff, it's very clear that those kids are going to think that they can continue to get away with stuff. And that's what we see happening with David's children. They're constantly just getting worse and worse and worse. So Amnon ends up raping his half-sister, and then murder takes place after that. And David didn't address any of these things. He was the king, meaning he carried out sentences and judgments. In fact, on Wednesday, when we talked about 2 Samuel 14, the first half of it, we saw David actively carrying out a sentence. We saw him being like a judge for the people of Israel. David was like a judge for Israel. So David should have been judging his home first and foremost and taking care of things within his own household. And probably many of the problems that arose wouldn't have arisen if David had just been an active father and also punished his kids the way he should have. In fact, there's a verse, I believe, that actually says that David never even asked his kids why they did these things. So that means that David never said anything negative to his children at any point in time. He never even asked them, son, why are you doing this? Like, why would you do something like that? David never confronted his kids. He just let things go. So now Absalom, after committing murder, David said it's okay for Absalom to come back home. But this was a half measure that was taken. First and foremost, David should have immediately gone and gotten Absalom away from Jeshurun, because after Absalom killed Amnon, which was unlawful for Absalom to do, even though Amnon was in the wrong, And David didn't address that. Absalom never should have killed him, right? That was illegal. You don't murder people. Absalom was in the wrong. David shouldn't have let him get away because David knew where Absalom was the entire time. He knew that Absalom had fled to Jeshurun because Absalom's grandpa was the king of Jeshurun. So David knew that Absalom was in Jeshurun. He should have went and got him. He should have brought him back to Israel, and he should have punished him in Israel very publicly, just as David would have done for any of his other subjects. He should have done the same thing for his own household. So he should have punished Absalom for this terrible sin that Absalom committed. But he didn't do that. So now, 3 years later, actually, David finally decides to bring Absalom back home because David was actually mourning for Absalom the entire time. He was very upset that Absalom was gone. In fact, it was affecting the way David was acting. And even Joab, David's commander, could see that there was something up with David. So that was when Joab devised that whole plan that we talked about on Wednesday for David to bring Absalom back home, which is what David should have done. He should have from the beginning brought Absalom back home, but he didn't do it. So now David finally decides to bring Absalom back home. I actually need to correct myself, though, for Wednesday's episode, because after studying it a little bit more, I think I was wrong. And here's why. I don't think that David should have brought Absalom back, like I initially said, to, repair things with him. I think he should have brought Absalom back to punish him and should have done it way quicker. This doesn't mean that I think that David should have put Absalom to death publicly or something like that, because what father can do that to his son? But there should have been a serious punishment for Absalom, I believe. There should have been retribution for that because Absalom, as we can see in today's portion of scripture, he thinks he did nothing wrong for killing his brother. He thinks it was within his right because here's what he says to Joab after he sets Joab's field on fire. He says, "If there is any iniquity in me, let the king kill me." This means that Absalom truly believes that he was in the right for killing Amnon. Absalom was getting prideful. He was beginning to think that he was a better leader than King David, but it was not within Absalom's jurisdiction to kill his brother. That was the king's jurisdiction to punish Amnon. And unfortunately, King David didn't punish Amnon. So Absalom was beginning to think of himself as a better judge and a better ruler than King David. And you can see now what is happening. You can see how Absalom's beginning to get prideful. You can see how he's beginning to think of himself as a better leader, a better judge, a better king than King David. And David should have nipped this thing in the bud way at the beginning. Because once again, Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, when the sentence for a crime is not carried out quickly, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. So let's talk about Absalom coming back home. Joab goes to go get Absalom, and Absalom, yes, comes back home. And here's David's punishment for Absalom. The king said, "Let him return to his house, but let him not see my face." So King David is basically like, all right, you know what? Absalom can come back home, but as his punishment, he's not going to be able to see me. This was the worst possible punishment ever. What a bad punishment. I'm going to disown my child, but only kind of. What a bad punishment. This would have bred so much resentment in Absalom, and it does actually, because Absalom had family in Jeshurun. His mom's side of the family were all kings in Jeshurun. So Absalom would have had it better in Jeshurun, being close to his family over there, than being back in Jerusalem, not being able to see his own father. I mean, this was a terrible punishment that would only breed more resentment. So the king is like, you know what? I'm going to partially disown my son. He can live nearby me. He can live within my area of Jerusalem, but I'm never going to see him. So Absalom returned to his own house and didn't see the king's face. Now in all of Israel, there was no one to be so praised as Absalom for his beauty. Remember what I talked about, how Absalom might be beginning to think of himself as a better judge a better king, a better ruler, because he's prideful. And it turns out that he's extremely handsome. He's the most handsome man in all of Israel, is what it says. He was so handsome that he didn't have a defect on him. It says, from the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head. That's what verse 25 says. So Absalom was so handsome. And he had this thick, long hair, is what it says. He would cut the hair of his head every single year at the end of the year because it would become too heavy for him. And then maybe it would give him headaches or something like that. But he'd go and get his hair cut because of how thick and luscious it was. Now, I used to be a hairdresser, and I have met people with very, very thick hair before. In fact, I know a few people personally that I've done their hair, and they were blessed with extremely thick hair. And when you wash that hair of theirs, it is so heavy. It turns so heavy when you get that water like trapped in that hair. But even without the water, it says that Absalom's hair weighed about 4 pounds. It said that he would weigh his hair after he cut it at 200 shekels after the king's weight. So the WEB says a shekel is about 10 grams or about 0.35 ounces. So 200 shekels is about 2 kilograms or about 4.4 pounds. So that means that Absalom's hair was very heavy, even without the water on it. So that is how blessed he was. I know me, I don't have thick hair at all. My hair is very thin. And I actually recently cut my hair, like cut it really short. And when I say really short, I mean like short, like above my ears. So it's kind of, it's like really short on the one side and then it kind of goes longer on the other. That's what my hair looks like right now. And I cut it myself because, like I said, I'm a hairdresser. So when I cut all of that hair off of my head, and my hair was decently long, it was past my shoulders when I cut it. And I can tell you that when I picked up all of that hair, it probably didn't even weigh a pound. Like that is how thin my hair is. Like a foot of hair of mine didn't even weigh a pound. Okay. So Absalom was a very blessed man to have this beautiful, thick and luscious hair that he would have to cut every year because it was too heavy. So it says here that 3 sons were born to Absalom and 1 daughter, and he named the daughter Tamar, and she was a lovely woman with a beautiful face. So he had even attractive children, and he happened to name his 1 daughter after his sister Tamar. That is how affectionate Absalom was for his sister. He named his daughter after her. So Absalom, it says, lived 2 full years in Jerusalem, and he didn't see the king's face. So this means that Absalom now has not seen David for about 5 years. Okay, it's been a long time since Absalom saw David. And Absalom is starting to get kind of antsy and angry that he's not allowed to see his father. Now, why do you think that he was angry about this? Well, we're going to see in the next chapters that Absalom, once again, he starts thinking that he can be a better king. And so it's very possible that the only reason he wanted to see David was so that he could get an in with David once again to usurp that throne from David. That is very possible that that's the reason that Absalom really wanted to see his father. Because I can imagine that Absalom was very angry at David, and he was probably very resentful of David as well, because David didn't father the way David should have been fathering. So it says in verse 30 that Absalom says to his servants, "Behold, Joab's field is near me, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." Because Absalom was trying to get Joab to put a good word in for him for David, and Joab wouldn't do it. Joab ignored Absalom twice, actually. So now this 3rd time, Absalom's like, "Hey, you know what? Joab has this field that's nearby mine. Go set it on fire. Go set all of his food on fire." And this was Joab's livelihood, don't forget. Like probably this field fed his family. And it was barley season. Can you imagine how terrible this would be for somebody to destroy your crop when that is what sustained your family? That'd be terrible. I have a tiny little garden in my front yard. And when I say tiny, I mean very small. It's like 4 little boxes of veggies. I would be infuriated if someone came along and just burned my veggies because they were mad at me or because they wanted my attention. I'd be so angry because I'd be like, I put time and effort and work into that. What gives you the right to come and burn my vegetables? But it was even more egregious back in these days when that was the source of income and the source of food for your family, your livelihood. And obviously this gets Joab's attention because his barley field is burned to the ground. So he comes and sees Absalom and he says, why have your servants set my field on fire? So he's extremely angry at Absalom, understandably. And this also just shows what a absolute jerk Absalom was. He was a total entitled brat. He was a jerk. Because think about it. I mean, that fire could have spread to somebody else's field. Who knows what damage that could have potentially caused? So Joab goes to see Absalom finally. Absalom gets what he wants, and Joab actually listens to Absalom instead of punching him in the face like he should have done. Joab goes to King David and puts a good word in for Absalom and asks King David to see Absalom. Now, I don't know if Joab told King David that Absalom burned his field or not. It's very possible that he did, because here's what it says. So Joab came to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. So I don't know if Joab mentioned the thing that Absalom had done to his field or not, but it says that when David saw Absalom, he kisses Absalom. So if David did know about this field that Absalom burned, once again, he did not punish his bratty child that he should have punished. He didn't punish him. Instead, he kisses Absalom. So you can see that there are some issues arising in David's household, some very major and serious issues. And unfortunately, those are only going to get worse. So King David is a really good example of what not to do if you are a parent. David is a great example for what to do if you are trying to worship God or pray to God or write music to God or even emulating David's faith, because David had so much faith in Yahweh. Those are good things about David that should be emulated. But the things that shouldn't be emulated is the way he treated his family and the way he didn't discipline his own children. Guys, I hope you liked today's episode. If you did, please share it on your social media platforms. And if you didn't get a chance to check out the video I did with Sarah M yet, I highly recommend that you do. It was a very, very fascinating YouTube video. And I think YouTube is trying to censor it because it's talking about some really touchy topics that YouTube doesn't like. And so it hasn't been getting pushed the way my YouTube videos normally get pushed, unfortunately. So make sure you watch it. It's linked in the description of this episode. Faithful listeners, I will see you all on Monday. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Happy listening, and God